In 1931, a national government was set up to try to reduce unemployment in Britain, and it was a coalition government of the three main parties, Conservatives, Liberals and Labour, and it was led by a gentleman called Ramsay MacDonald. So 1931, the national government was set up. National government was set up. It was almost like an emergency government where politicians from all the different parties said, listen, we've got to club together to help Britain recover from this depression. Now, there was an argument and a debate about how best to deal with the problem of the depression. There was the traditional view, which was the view that there would have to be that the government should do very little to help the economy and the depressed areas. There was this view that the depression was part of this natural cycle of boom and slump, and eventually everything would be okay. Herbert Hoover in the USA would be the gentleman, if you like, that we would associate with that traditional view. And in this traditional view, the government should concentrate on cutting spending and balancing the budget. I suppose you might call it a little bit of the view of the coalition in Britain today, of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats today. Cutting spending, balancing the budget. This is important because it gives that stability. So it's all about balancing the budget. The budget and limited intervention. That's what the traditional view is about. And if we were to pick a politician or a leader who followed this kind of view, Neville Chamberlain would be a good bet. And he was actually the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the national government in 1931. But opposite to Chamberlain and friends, we have a more revolutionary approach, which was to spend. And again, this was modelled by Franklin Roosevelt. When he became president of the USA in 1933, his New Deal policy was very much about this opposite view. And it was put forward by the British economist John Keynes, who put this forward. John Keynes, the opposite to Chamberlain. Keynes argued that government spending, especially on public work schemes, would kickstart the economy and provide jobs for the unemployed. And this would revive the British economy in all sorts of different ways. So it was about spending on public works. Spending on public works. The government did, I suppose, a combination of these two, but you would have to say their main focus was on the traditional view. But if I just split the screen now into two. First of all, the short-term things that the government did to tackle the depression. So we'll call that one short-term measures. And over here we'll have the long-term measures that the government introduced to tackle the depression. So all we mean by that is we've got things that the government did straight away that would affect things immediately, and we've got things that they would persist with over a longer period of time. So to start with your short-term measures, in 1931 the government introduced these. So the first one was spending cuts. And this is all about saving money, balancing the budget, saving money. And the idea was that all government workers would have their wages cut by 10%. Okay, so straight away you are saving money if you're the government. The second thing they decided to do, the national government, was to come off. They came off what was called the gold standard. The gold standard. Very simply, this was where the pound, which was obviously the British currency of the time, the pound was valued against how much gold Britain actually had in reserve. And it kept the value of the pound very, very high, which meant that exports were expensive. So by coming off the gold standard, it had the effect of reducing the value of the pound against foreign currencies, which meant British exports became cheaper and imports became more expensive. And this actually helped British exporters and encouraged the British people to buy British. So it was a dual effect. It helped exporters and it helped companies who were trying to sell within Britain. The currency was of less value. Furthermore, the government introduced something called the means test. And we will talk about this separately in another tutorial. But the means test was a way in which they would measure the amount of assistance that would be given to the unemployed based on their household income and other checks. So it was all about checking who was going to get what in terms of welfare, in terms of the dole, but even beyond the dole, just unemployment benefits. And it was all about saving money, and it was all about tackling the high cost of unemployment benefit for the government. Again, there are mirrors with today, if you think about it. And then also they raised income tax. Income tax was raised. So the amount of money that obviously people in work had to pay in tax was raised. And again, it's about giving the government more money, and it's about paying off Britain's debts, which it's got to pay off to the USA. In the long term, the government also introduced a series of measures to try and make things better, especially for British business. So in 1932, they introduced the Import Duties Act. The Import Duties Act. This put a 10 to 20% duty on all imports. 10% to 20% duty on all imports. Okay, now if you obviously put a duty on imports, it's like buying in a fridge into the United Kingdom. The fridge is costing £100. Now it's coming in from, say, the USA. What you're doing with an import duty is you're putting 10% onto that. So actually the buy price in the UK would be £110 because there's a 10% import duty. So vice versa, if you have a British company producing their fridge for the same price of £100, there is no import duty on their product, so they can sell to market for £10 cheaper. Now that means that other businesses from outside the UK will be discouraged from selling their product into the UK, but it also is going to help those companies themselves because they'll be able to employ more people because they'll be selling more products. Okay, that's the idea behind this Import Duties Act of 1932. It benefited new industries like the motor vehicle and electrical goods. Those kind of companies did benefit, but it had little effect on the older industries which we mentioned on the previous tutorial. So like coal, shipbuilding, cotton, steel. No, these businesses relied on exports. This does nothing for exports. It is the Import Duties Act. Okay. Now, the other thing that the government did was it signed something called the Ottawa Agreements. The Ottawa Agreements. The Otter Agreements allow Commonwealth countries to trade with each other on better terms. So it was like a kind of free trade agreement within the Commonwealth. So it meant Britain could buy food cheaply from countries like Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And it also helped revive trade by providing a market for British exports. So we mentioned this Import Duties Act. A lot of countries in Europe and beyond responded to this by introducing their own 10 to 20% import duties, which actually had had a bad effect on British companies trying to export. But these Ottawa Agreements allowed British exporters to export into Canada, Australia and New Zealand at a better rate. And it did provide a market for British exports. Another thing the British government did in the long term was the exchange Equalization account, which actually lasted until the 1980s. But it was actually set up in 1931. In 1931, the government ran out of foreign currency. So it ran out of basically paper money in other currencies. So what this account did is it made sure that Britain could not run out of foreign currency again. The exchange control set up by the exchange equalization account lasted all the way to the 1980s. So it basically gave Britain a stockpile of foreign currency that it could use to buy products from other countries in emergency. Other things that the British government did in the long term was they introduced something called the Special Areas Act. The Special Areas Act. This was quite a clever scheme in a way, because what the government said was the worst hit areas like Clydeside, South Wales, Northern Ireland, these became known as the special areas. And in 1934, the government passed this bill called the Special Areas Act, and it basically offered money to companies to relocate their premises into the special areas. So a really good example would be the Team Valley Trading Estate in Gateshead, which was actually a whole collection of companies that had been given grants to move into that area. So there was up to £2 million of grants on offer for companies who would move their premises into the special areas. The outcome was not that impressive. I think 8.4 million was given in the end to these companies. 121 firms were set up in these areas, but only 15,000 jobs were created. If you imagine the unemployment rate is in the millions, 15,000 jobs is not a huge amount of jobs to be created by the Special Areas Act. Ultimately, all of these policies were not amazingly successful in dealing with the problem of unemployment, and we can actually see that by although there is a reduction, but if you imagine that in 1932 there's 2.8 million people unemployed, 1934 there's 2.5, 1935 there's 2.4, 1936 there's 2.3. So it's really slow progress. We're only talking 100,000, it going down 100,000 over those years. It wasn't until really after 1936, when we have after 1936, that it really started to drop off. And this was due to global rearmament because of the problem of Hitler in Germany. Countries were starting to build weapons again and wanted ships, for example, for their navies, and this created jobs in Britain, and that's what really accelerated the unemployment rate coming down. So to illustrate that, 1934 the unemployment rate was 2.5 million. 1935 it was 2.3 million. This is in the middle of all of these policies that the government introduced, and it wasn't until 1937, sorry, that's 36 there, 37, that we come down to 1.8 when we've got 500,000 people coming into jobs. But again, a lot of those jobs are going to be associated with the rearmament drive and just a general pickup in trade. A pickup in global trade that actually occurred in the mid-1930s anyway. So how much you can put down to these measures, I'm not entirely sure. But there was some that were genuinely successful.